Welcome to Technicians Tuesday, everybody. Today we are going to be cutting, installing, and glassing up the transom of our 1992 23-foot Ocean Master center console. If this is your first experience with fiberglass, prepare to consume a ton of information today. You'll also want to subscribe and hit that notification bell so that every Tuesday you can continue to learn more and more about your boat and how it works. I gotta thank my buddy Steve from Advanced Marine for being so nice and letting us pull the boat in here into his shop. It made this process so much easier having a good open working space with the right amount of counter space to work off of over the weekend. We've gotten this edge all ground out and we've got the inside of the transom all prepped up, including these sides here, and we are all ready to get our template cut and start in laying some fiberglass. Which is the first thing that we will do is cut out that template to help guide us in cutting down our transom material. So we just took a large piece of cardboard and laid our cutout from the old transom onto the cardboard and cut it down to the right shape, but left it a little bit big so that we could stick it into the transom and trim the piece down to the right size of our transom. You will want to do this regardless of whether you are using plywood or Coosa board. For us, we ran a poll on the channel about a month ago to see what everyone would like to see the transom made out of, either plywood or Coosa board, and almost 60% of the community wanted to see the Coosa get put in. So as I'm looking around at different sites and suppliers of Coosa, I came across a video with the famous John Graviscus from Shipshape TV talking about doing a transom on a Pursuit at the Boat Outfitters plant in the middle of Florida. I've never heard of them before, but after looking into Boat Outfitters, we called them up and ordered the Coosa that we needed. Now for this transom, it's a little different than most transoms because it has this chunk here on the inside of the transom, making the outside or the actual transom a lot thinner, meaning that we had to go with a piece of 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch Coosa opposed to using two 3/4 inch pieces like you normally would. Before getting too far into this process though, we'd like to get everybody's feedback on something. While we are looking at BoatOutfitters.com, you can see they make a ton of these starboard and acrylic accessories, storage boxes, and all kinds of stuff. But what piqued our interest are these custom dash panels. Most of you that have been following this build know that we have some issues that we need to address with our dash panel. So we want to know what you guys think. Should we do starboard or acrylic? We can see if they can cut it down and shape it for us, and then obviously I'll do all the cutouts so that you guys can see that part of it. Let us know what you think in the comment section below. Once we got the template cut out and shaped down to the actual size of the transom, it's time to get into cutting down our Coosa. Now everything that you see here is going to be the same process for using regular plywood, but I started out with a 3/4 inch piece to go in first. With plywood you can trace out the template onto the wood with a marker, but on Coosa, since it's black, as you cut along the line it begins to disappear, making it difficult to get a clean cut done. So I just stuck the template back onto the board and used a jigsaw to cut out our first piece of the transom. Once that was cut out, we need to cut the piece in half so that we can slide it in one section at a time. I tried the whole zigzag method to try and get a stronger fit together, but I don't know if this really made a difference or not, so you can cut it straight if you'd like to. But now that we have our two pieces, we need to start trimming them down and dry fitting them into the transom, taking off as little as possible from the pieces to give us the most strength that we can get. This can get pretty time consuming, and I like to use this little polisher with an aggressive sanding pad on it to trim down the pieces on the edges that need to be taken down just a little bit. Eventually we'll get our pieces cut all the way down until they fit together and inside the transom nicely. Then we'll move to the inside of the boat where we are going to pre-drill holes, and we'll be using drywall screws, or in this case these Durox screws, which are what I had on hand, in order to suck the Coosa up against the existing glass. We'll do this so that when we go to do the actual fiberglassing, we can put our mat and resin in between them and then suck the Coosa and the existing glass together to hold them together while the resin dries. This is the weekend of Hurricane Dorian, so if everybody can give Steve a big thumbs up for letting us use his shop. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have been able to work on the transom this weekend and get this video made. So smash that like button and we can begin to cut out our outside piece of Coosa. I ground off our screws on the outside just so that we can dry fit our outside pieces in and keep our inside Coosa from falling out. It helps to make the job a little more manageable if you are working by yourself. Then we just repeated the process and cut out the 1/2 inch piece of Coosa using our template. This piece we want to cut into 3 pieces though. This way we can insert the outside pieces and then we'll slide the middle piece down into position. We cut these with straight lines though this time, opposed to the curved cut we made on the other piece. We had to trim these pieces down around the edges to get them to slide down into place, but after a few hours of cutting, trimming, and placing, we got all of our Cusa board cut up and ready to be glassed in. The next step in this process is more preparation. A lot about fiberglassing is that most of the work is all prepping. We've got our pieces cut out and we'll use them to cut our mat down. You use the mat in between two surfaces as a bonding agent. We basically just take our transom piece and lay it down on top of the piece of mat and then cut out the piece using a sharp utility knife. We cut out two of these pieces to go in between the existing glass and our first pieces of Cusa, and then the second piece to go between the two pieces of Cusa board. Now before doing anything, there's some tools and supplies that are needed to do any kind of fiberglass work. I live in the Florida Keys, so when I do anything with fiberglass, I get all of my stuff from Fiberglass Coatings or FGCI. They're one of the biggest fiberglass supply companies here in Florida, which makes them probably one of the most inexpensive suppliers to get fiberglass stuff from if you live here in Florida. We'll be using that mat we were just talking about, and we are using this 1.5 ounce mat. Then we will be using this 24-ounce fiberglass stitch mat for our structural glass, whereas the mat isn't really a structural or strength providing glass. We'll need some acetone for cleaning tools, some polyester resin roller covers that go on a 9-inch paint roller, and a paint roller tray. Then we'll be using polyester opposed to epoxy, so we'll be using this FGCI GP hand layup polyester resin and mixing it with this MEK-P, which is basically the hardener or the catalyst. Because of how hot it is here, we'll be mixing up the resin at 1% MEK to 100% resin. This will give us the longest amount of working time before the resin starts to heat up and then gels up before it hardens. We need to work quickly because as soon as it gels up, that's game over and we had better be done with what we are doing. We will mix up 2 quarts at a time, and then once we get those quarts laid out, we'll mix up more as needed as we work along. Another trick about doing glass work for me, I like to put on 3 or 4 gloves at a time, so when one gets sticky, I can take it off quickly and then just keep working without having to stop. We'll take our 2 quarts of resin and mix in our 20 cc's of MEK and stir it up. After a few seconds of mixing, we can pour our resin into the paint pan and then we'll wet out our transom. Once we've got the transom nice and wet, we'll roll out our mat onto the transom, then come back over it with more resin and wet the mat out until we get the mat completely saturated with resin. It's important to have something underneath the transom to catch any of the resin that drips off while doing this as well, just to keep a nice clean work area. Then once we get the mat wet, we'll take our piece of Cusa and completely wet the one side of it up with resin, then stick it into the transom. After we've got both of the pieces of Cusa into the transom, we'll jump up into the boat and put our screws in and suck the Cusa up against the existing glass with our screws. We'll leave this for about 4 or 5 hours or so, giving the resin long enough to completely dry and bond the transom together. Then we can take the screws back out of the Cusa and we'll get started on putting the outside piece in. But we'll do something a little different this time though. We want to fill this gap that goes around the transom, and we will fill it with a mixture of resin and silica. Now this silica is super nasty stuff and can do some serious damage to your lungs, so you want to make sure you wear a mask whenever you're mixing it up. We'll prep out 4 quarts of resin and then a separate pint to mix up our silica in. We'll mix up the resin and the MEK and then pour in the silica and mix it up until it gets to be this peanut buttery consistency, and we'll then take that and go around the edge using a putty knife to work the putty into the edge. Now be conscious of how much you put into this lip though. It is going to make it more difficult to put our Cusa into place. so we don't want to overfill it, but once we've got the lip filled, we'll wet out the Cusa just like we did before. Then roll on the piece of mat that we have prepped and wet that piece out as best as you can. Someone that does fiberglass every day can probably wet this out without leaving any air in it, but I just load it up with tons and tons of resin so that when we wet out the Cusa piece and get it in place, the pressure will push most of the air out. Since we put all of that putty into the lip, we'll have to take a piece of wood and a hammer, then hammer the Cusa pieces into place, forcing all of that putty into any gaps that are in the lips of the transom. We'll wet out the middle piece next and then slide that piece down into the transom and then hammer it into place as well. Now we've got to quickly take our drill and pre-drill holes for our screws to go in. We'll then put the screws into the Cusa and suck the outside piece up against the inside piece, sucking them together where we can clean off all the putty that was pushed out of the edges, and we will leave the transom to dry overnight. It's best to do this entire process in one shot so that the transom can dry together as one solid unit. The next day we can take out all of the screws, and then we'll get to prepping the fiberglass and cutting it down and ordering it so that we can start laying it out. What we want to do is cut our glass out to fill out this whole panel and build it out to get it even with our existing fiberglass lip here. This way our transom will come out as smooth as possible and make it a lot easier to fare out and make it smooth before shooting the gel coat. We'll make one sheet of the woven to fit on first, then we'll make a second sheet to go over that, and then we'll have 2 layers of mat to go on top of the woven once we get everything on. By taking our cardboard template and clamping it to the transom, we can go around and trim it down to fit perfectly inside of the fiberglass edges, and we'll use that to cut down our glass sheets. Using a yardstick, we can hold pressure down on the template to help us make a good clean cut down the piece of fiberglass. We'll also leave this top edge intact so that we can roll it over the top of the transom and down the inside. You will want to save any excess pieces of glass and mat that you cut off of the sheets. We can use them elsewhere depending on what kind of project you are doing. We'll then take each piece and clamp it up onto the transom to make sure that it fits up nicely. We'll also use these same clamps when it comes time to lay the glass up as we are rolling the resin on. It just makes it a lot easier to do if you have to do this by yourself. We'll basically continue cutting down our sheets and dry fitting them on the transom one at a time, then laying them off to the side so that we know which pieces go on and in what order. For our second piece of glass and our mat though, we'll cut them just a little bit bigger than we did the first piece so that it will extend over and cover a portion of the edge of the existing fiberglass lip. We also want to cut a section to cover the inside lower portion of the transom as well. We'll get that piece by cutting out a piece that we will use to fix our deck panel section that was rotten. If you haven't seen that video yet, you can check it out by clicking the card in the top right hand corner of the screen. Once we have all of our pieces of glass cut though, it's best to lay them out, and using a marker we'll number the pieces so that when we get into mixing up our resin and rolling out the pieces, we don't have to stop and figure anything out. We just grab the next piece and keep on rolling out the resin. Now we are pretty much ready to get started. We'll lay out our pieces close to where we'll use them, set our ladder up, and have all of our tools and things laying out right where we need them to be. Then we'll start by mixing up some more silica putty and filling in all the screw holes and the gaps between the Cusa pieces and around the edge. Then we'll just wet out the entire transom and lay on the first piece of glass. Once we've got it situated, we can take our clamps and clamp the piece to hold it in place as we begin to wet it out. The thing about this is that it takes a ton of resin to wet out the woven pieces of fiberglass, so just laying the resin on as thick as you can and letting it soak it up is the best thing that I can say to do. We'll take what is called a rib roller, and using this we will work out as much air as we possibly can. We'll also use the rib roller to work out any spots where the glass might wrinkle or have a seam that won't lay down. You can really work the glass down and add more resin to smooth it out. Once our first piece of glass is on and wetted out the best we can get it, we'll wet out the lower section of the inside of the transom and lay on our piece of woven here in the transom to overlap our first piece of glass. Wet that piece out as liberally as possible and just keep feeding it resin until you get as much air out of the glass as possible. Then we can take our next piece of glass and lay that over the top of the transom and push it into place. Once it's in place, start loading it up with resin and just keep mixing up more resin and rolling it into the glass as quickly as you can. We'll keep putting resin into it until it gets to be a darker color. If you see this right now, you can see all of the white on the glass. That is all air and dry glass. We want to keep applying resin until it gets more of this darker color like you see here. There's still a couple of little dry areas, but you can see the darker sections, and that's what we're shooting for. Just keep rolling on more resin, and then we'll lay on the mat after we get our last piece of woven wetted out the best we can. This process just continues on by applying as much resin as we possibly can and rolling out our sheets until they are completely saturated with resin. We are almost done glassing up the transom, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel because next week we'll be putting the bulkhead in and installing the deck. Also, don't forget to smash that like button and we'll put on our last piece of mat here on the inside. Then we'll continue to wet them out until we have all of the glass on and soaked with as much resin as we can get it to take. We still need to fair out the transom before shooting with paint or gel coat. You can reach us on our website at bornagainboating.com, and now you know how to fiberglass a transom with Composite board. Thank you for hanging out with us today. Enjoy your Tuesday night and we'll see you next week.